They never notice the moment it shifts. The numbers still look fine. The streets still feel busy. But something inside the system has already changed. Every collapse has a phase that almost everyone ignores. Not the dramatic break, not the visible crisis, the quiet middle, when structures still stand, routines still run, and institutions still speak with confidence. This is a phase where denial feels reasonable, where continuity feels earned, and where collective behavior keeps moving forward even as deeper foundations begin to loosen. History doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. Empires, markets, and organizations rarely fail in a single event. They move through transitions. They pass through stages. First comes expansion, then complexity, then saturation. And somewhere after that, there's a subtle shift. Growth slows. Coordination weakens. Trust thins. Decisions become reactive instead of deliberate. The system doesn't announce this change. It absorbs it. From the outside, everything still appears functional. Shops open on time. Reports get filed. Meetings get scheduled. People commute, consume, and plan their weekends. On paper, the structures are intact. But inside, something has started to drift. This is the phase they overlook. Not because people are foolish. Because humans are wired for continuity. We assume tomorrow will resemble yesterday. We lean on habits. We rely on familiar signals. When the surface looks stable, the mind feels an arrest. Systems depend on that instinct. They rely on momentum. They rely on routine. They rely on the quiet agreement that tomorrow will operate more or less like today. And as long as those rhythms continue, the deeper changes stay invisible. What makes this phase so powerful is its calm. There is no obvious panic, no universal alarm. Instead, there is normalization. Small disruptions are reframed as temporary. Structural stresses are labeled cyclical. Delays are explained away. Every signal is interpreted through the lens of recovery. Inside institutions, people keep doing their jobs. Managers chase targets. Analysts update models. Administrators follow procedures. Everyone operates within their assigned lane, solving local problems, while the larger pattern quietly evolves beyond any single perspective. This is how systems soften before they fracture, not through sudden chaos, but through accumulated strain, through layers of complexity that outpace coordination, through incentives that drift away from long-term stability, through decisions made under pressure, then justified after the fact, and most of all, through collective psychology. When enough people believe stability is normal, instability becomes invisible. When confidence is repeated often enough, doubt feels out of place. When structures have lasted for generations, it becomes difficult to imagine them changing at all. But change doesn't ask permission. It moves slowly, quietly, beneath familiar routines. It travels through balance sheets and bureaucracies, through supply chains and social norms. It reshapes expectations before it reshapes outcomes. This ignored phase is where trajectories are set, where small choices compound, where adaptation is still possible, but rarely pursued, because nothing feels urgent yet. By the time urgency arrives, this chapter is already over, and that is the pattern we're going to follow. It reminds us that endings often begin quietly, long before anyone agrees with it. Across history, this quiet phase appears again and again. In late Roman administration, records multiplied while roads decayed. In imperial China, court rituals grew elaborate as provincial coordination weakened. In medieval city-states, merchant guilds thrived even as fiscal systems hardened. Each society carried on, convinced its arrangements were durable, even while internal balances shifted. The same rhythm shows up in financial architectures. Credit expands, instruments proliferate, oversight becomes layered, and responsibility disperses. Complexity feels like sophistication. New offices are created to manage the old ones. Committees form to supervise committees. Every adjustment makes sense locally. Collectively, the structure becomes harder to steer. What's striking is how rarely people recognize the transition while they're living inside it. Chroniclers write later about decadence or excess, but participants mostly experience busyness. They attend ceremonies. They negotiate contracts. They debate policy language. Daily life remains full, and that fullness disguises fragility. Psychologists call this normalcy bias. Sociologists describe institutional momentum. Historians simply document patterns. When systems grow large, they reward conformity and discourage disruption. Careers are built inside existing frameworks. Status comes from mastering the rules, not questioning them. So signals that don't fit the prevailing story are filtered out. Look at the great trading empires. Ports stayed active long after strategic reach narrowed. Fleets were maintained even as logistics faltered. Revenues were reported even as collection grew uneven. Leaders issued confident statements, while regional administrators improvised quietly. The surface stayed polished. The interior became patchwork. This phase is also when language changes. Setbacks become adjustments. Constraint become headwinds. Temporary measures turn permanent. Every term softens reality, just enough to preserve morale. People don't lie to each other so much as they speak in ways that keep cooperation possible. Meanwhile, obligations accumulate. Promises stack on top of promises. Future capacity is borrowed to stabilize the present. The architecture holds, but only because pressure is redistributed rather than resolved. From the inside, it feels like management. From the outside, it looks like endurance. And still, most individuals are not blind. They sense something is off. They notice delays. They feel workloads intensify. They watch experienced colleagues leave. But isolated observations rarely become shared understanding. Each person assumes someone else is tracking the bigger picture. This is the overlooked chapter. When awareness is fragmented, when responsibility is diffuse, and when continuity masks transition, if these patterns feel familiar, you might want to stay with this channel. This is a kind of slow-moving dynamic we spend time unpacking. Because once this phase passes, explanations get louder and narratives get sharper. People argue about causes and assign blame, yet the decisive shifts already happened during the quiet stretch, when attention was elsewhere. That's why history keeps rhyming. The evidence is always there, dispersed across memos and minutes, across budgets and behavior. It just rarely arrives as a single moment everyone agrees to notice. Documents age in cabinets. Databases fill with exceptions. Training manuals grow thicker. The process keeps moving, staffed by people who care, constrained by structures that cannot feel. By the time clarity forms, momentum has already been converted into precedent, and precedent governs comes next. Inside every large system, there is a delay between cause and recognition. Decisions ripple outward through departments, markets, and communities at different speeds. Feedback arrives late, diluted by layers of interpretation. By the time outcomes become visible, the original choices are often distant memories, made by people who have moved on. This is how erosion works in complex structures, not through sudden rupture, but through misaligned incentives that persist just long enough to become standard practice. Trust thins as processes replace relationships. Metrics multiply, yet meaning becomes harder to extract. Each unit optimizes for its own survival, while the whole grows less coherent. Institutional inertia plays a quiet role here. Procedures are designed for stability, not adaptation. Once a framework is in place, changing it requires approvals, reviews, and consensus across groups that experience the same pressures differently. So adjustments arrive slowly, even when signals are strong. Within these environments, individuals rarely feel powerful. A manager inherits targets. An analyst inherits models. A regulator inherits statutes. Everyone works within constraints they did not design. They solve for immediate problems, deferring structural questions because those belong to someone else. Over time, this produces a peculiar form of blindness, not ignorance, but compartmentalization. People become highly skilled at their specific tasks while losing sight of how those tasks interact. Success is measured locally. Failure is distributed globally. Trust erodes in subtle ways. First, between departments, then between institutions, eventually between people and the structures meant to serve them. But this erosion doesn't announce itself. It shows up as longer response times, heavier documentation, and cautious language. Each change feels rational on its own. Delayed reactions compound the effect. Early disruptions are absorbed by buffers. Reserves are drawn down. Temporary fixes are normalized. Every patch buys time, but also embeds fragility deeper into the architecture. The system learns to operate under strain, and that strain becomes a new baseline. What makes this phase difficult to perceive is that productivity often continues. Reports are delivered. Services function. Transactions clear. On the surface, performance metrics remain acceptable. Underneath, resilience is being traded for continuity. People inside these systems adapt emotionally as well. They lower expectations. They redefine success. They tell themselves that complexity is simply the price of scale. Fatigue becomes part of the job description. Uncertainty becomes routine. And because everyone is busy, reflection gets postponed. There's also a social dimension. Speaking openly about structural problems can feel risky. It challenges hierarchies. It threatens established narratives. So concerns are raised cautiously, framed in technical terms, and routed through channels that soften their impact. Over time, even those who once noticed a shift begin to normalize them. The extraordinary becomes ordinary. The provisional becomes permanent. The language of exception becomes a language of policy. This is not corruption in the dramatic sense. It is accommodation. It is adaptation. It is humans doing what humans do inside large systems, adjusting to pressure while hoping stability returns. But systems remember these adjustments. They encode them into procedures and precedents. And once encoded, they guide future behavior, even when the original context has disappeared. That is how transitions complete themselves quietly, not through one decisive failure, but through accumulated compromises that feel reasonable in isolation. In the present era, the same dynamics appear in quieter forms. Markets adjust through automated systems that move faster than human judgment. Corporations reorganize constantly, announcing efficiency while redistributing risk. Governments publish reassuring dashboards even as backlogs grow. Everything feels managed, yet few people can explain how the whole actually works. Daily life keeps its rhythm. Packages arrive. Apps update. Buildings light up at dusk. These signals of continuity become emotional anchors. They tell us the structure is intact. But beneath them, coordination grows brittle. Dependencies multiply. A missed shipment here, a delayed approval there, and suddenly entire workflows stall. What stands out is how easily stress becomes normalized. Temporary measures linger. Emergency tools become standard features. Departments learn to operate with less margin and then less again. Over time, organizations begin to treat scarcity as competence. Doing more with less turns into doing barely enough with exhaustion. In financial networks, confidence travels faster than comprehension. Products spread across balance sheets, abstracted into models few fully understand. Risk is sliced, packaged, and sold until responsibility feels distant. Each institution trusts that diversification protects it. Collectively, they lean on the same assumptions. In civic systems, the pattern is similar. Agencies grow thicker with procedure. Public language becomes careful and calibrated. Reports emphasize resilience while quietly revising expectations. People sense friction in everyday interactions, but it arrives as inconvenience, not crisis. So it is tolerated. Inside large corporations, employees adapt to rolling reorganizations. Titles change. Teams merge. Metrics reset. The narrative is always progress. Yet the human experience is cumulative fatigue. Knowledge walks out the door. Continuity lives in slide decks. Memory becomes fragmented. What rarely changes is the underlying psychology. When complexity rises, people cling to familiar frameworks. They compare today to yesterday, not to trajectory. They focus on quarterly outcomes rather than structural drift. And because many changes arrive as software updates or policy revisions, they feel reversible, even when they are not. This is also where collective behavior plays its part. Individuals mirror institutional tone. If leaders project calm, others suppress unease. If dashboards show green, doubts stay private. Over time, the gap between lived experience and official narratives widens. But cooperation depends on pretending it does not. The overlooked phase thrives on this gap. It feeds on the space between metrics and meaning. It advances while attention is fragmented across screens and schedules. By the time disruptions become visible to everyone, the deeper transitions have already reshaped incentives and expectations. None of this requires villains. It emerges from scale, from specialization, from systems that reward continuity more than reflection. People do their jobs. Organizations protect their mandates. The architecture evolves on its own timetable. And so the cycle moves forward, carried by routines that feel ordinary, guided by structures that no one person controls, settling quietly into its next configuration. It does not announce itself as sirens. It arrives as policy revisions, staffing changes, and revised forecasts. It feels administrative. It sounds reasonable. And because it wears a language of maintenance, most people experience it as background noise, not transformation, until the consequences surface much later for everyone. By the time people begin asking what changed, the change is already settled in. That is how this phase completes itself. Quietly, not with single breaking point, but with a gradual rearranging of expectations. Systems adapt to strain. Structures learn to operate with less margin. Collective behavior shifts just enough to keep things moving. Even as deeper balances continue to drift, small shifts compound quietly across every layer. Every cycle carries this moment. After expansion, after confidence, after complexity, there comes a stretch where continuity feels convincing. Institutions still function. Contracts are honored. Infrastructure hums along. And because life remains busy, the mind assumes stability. But stability is not the same as health. What actually changes during this phase is relationship. Trust becomes procedural. Accountability becomes distributed. Memory becomes fragmented across databases and departments. People rely more on dashboards than on judgment, more on policy than on context. Each adjustment feels practical. Together, they reshape how decisions are made. History shows that this is when trajectories harden, not when crowds gather, and not when headlines turn sharp, but earlier, when small compromises accumulate and become embedded in routine. Once that happens, reversal grows difficult, not because anyone refuses, but because the system itself has learned a new way to operate. Individuals inside these structures rarely feel dramatic loss. They feel tired. They feel constrained. They feel the quiet pressure of expectations that keep rising while resources thin. They adapt. They document. They escalate when required. And then they return to their desks. From the outside, it looks like resilience. From the inside, it feels like maintenance. This is why the overlooked phase matters. It is where momentum is converted into precedent, where temporary workarounds become permanent features, where future outcomes are quietly negotiated through everyday choices. And it is also why these patterns keep returning, not because people forget history, but because the mechanics repeat. Scale produces distance. Distance produces abstraction. Abstraction produces delay. And delay gives transitions time to settle before anyone agrees they are real. If you find yourself drawn to this way of looking at systems, you're welcome to subscribe, not for answers or predictions, but for careful observation of how these cycles unfold again and again across different structures and eras. Because once the louder phases arrive, interpretation becomes crowded. Everyone has an opinion. Everyone has a theory. But the deeper story is almost always written earlier, in spreadsheets and procedures, in meeting minutes and quiet revisions. Collapse, when it finally becomes visible, feels sudden. Yet it is usually the last chapter of a much longer process. The ignored phase is where that process does most of its work. And when you look back across centuries of institutions and economies, across empires and organizations, one truth keeps resurfacing. The turning points rarely announce themselves. They move softly through systems that still appear functional, guided by collective habits that feel reasonable at the time. History doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes in the pauses between certainty and consequence, where everything still seems normal and almost no one realizes they are already living inside the next transition.